In the early days of Middle-earth, as the evil of Melkor begins to infect the lands of Valinor, the elves of Feanor become restless. Led by their master, these Noldor begin to forge great weaponry. Not only swords, but also spears and axes. Weapons that would be used by great heroes of Middle-earth for ages to come. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we're talking about the great axes and other brutal weapons in the history of Middle-earth. While axes would no doubt become synonymous with the dwarves of Middle-earth, men and elves have long histories with these weapons as well. Not only did the Noldor create axes to combat the threat of Morgoth while in Valinor, but far off in Beleriand, axes would become a main weapon of the Sindar. In Doriath, King Fingal traded with the dwarves to obtain many great swords, spears, and axes. These axes would actually be the main weapon of the March Wardens of his realm. Elsewhere in the First Age, the men of Hithlum were known for wielding axes as well. One of these men was Hurin of Dorlomin, who has quite possibly the most epic of all deeds with an axe in the entire history of Middle-earth. Last of all, Hurin stood alone. Then he cast aside his shield and wielded an axe two-handed, and it is sung that the axe smoked in the black blood of the troll guard of Gothmog until it withered. And each time that he slew, Hurin cried, "Aure in Entuluva, day shall come again." 70 times he uttered that cry. Finally, Hurin is buried under the bodies of his slain enemies and taken captive. But his deed would live on for his incredible fighting and bravery. Another of the great axe wielders of the First Age is Hurin's nephew, Tuor. Tuor's story is one that is greatly deserving of his own video, but for now we'll just stick to his weapon. Tuor's axe is one of the few with a name, which we find in the pages of the Book of Lost Tales Part 2. Its name is Dramborleg, meaning futter sharp, because it smote both heavy as a club and would cleave like a sword. In this same book, it states that Tuor fights with Dramborleg in the fall of Gondolin, using it to kill 3 Balrogs and the Lord of the Orcs. Now we should note that this is not the most recent version of Tolkien's story. Thus, these details are a bit of a gray area on what could be considered canon. We find out in Unfinished Tales that like the Sword of Thingol and the Bow of Bregor, Dramborleg comes to be an heirloom of Numenor, passed through his line until it is lost when Numenor is destroyed by the sea. The Numenoreans not only received the axe of Tuor, but also the knowledge of crafting weapons from their elven allies. However, unlike their use of bow and arrow, they would use axes not for battle, but for trees. You see, in the 7th century of the Second Age, the Numenoreans began a large-scale deforestation of Meneriath, leading the men of that region to become openly hostile toward these ship kings. Their descendants and their grudge toward the men of the West would live on in the Dunlendings. Axes also make an appearance in one of my personal favorite monuments in all of Middle-earth, the Argonath. While in Peter Jackson's adaptation, the Argonath shows Elendil and Isildur holding swords, the Argonath actually were statues of Isildur and his brother Anarion, and they held axes in their right hands, while raising their left in gestures of defiance to the enemies of Gondor. Now before we get to the stout-hearted dwarves, let's mention a couple of weapons that, while not axes, are other close combat weapons worth mentioning. The first comes in the Book of Lost Tales, where we find an earlier version of the fall of Gondolin. In this story, Rog is a lord and blacksmith of Gondolin. He is the leader of one of the houses of Gondolin, the House of the Hammer of Wrath. It is said that he used a long-handed mace, and that his words of passion inspired his kindred to slay a number of Balrogs, creatures who had never before been slain by elves or men. He and his men would be trapped and slain in the downfall of the city. Speaking of Balrogs, they, along with orcs, were also known to have used axes in war. Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs, used a black axe according to the Silmarillion. The most famous mace in Middle-earth was Grond, the hammer of the underworld. This mace belonged to Morgoth himself. In his duel with Fingolfin, It is said that each time Grond struck the ground, it shook the land like a bolt of thunder and created great pits from which smoke and fire erupted. It should be noted that the Grond of the Third Age, the great battering ram used at Minas Tirith, is an entirely different device, merely named after the mace of Sauron's former master. In the film adaptations, Sauron is given a mace to wield as well, likely in honor of Morgoth's Grond. However, in the books, it is never specified what, if any, weapon Sauron uses, aside from his own dark magic and the One Ring. In Sauron's fight during the Last Alliance, we find another noteworthy weapon that doesn't really fit into any of our previous video categories: Aiglos, the spear of King Gil-galad. Gil-galad is the High King of the Noldor, who leads the elves in the Battle of the Last Alliance. Aiglos, which means snow point or icicle, is greatly feared by the orcs of Mordor, and is instrumental in helping Gil-galad and Elendil throw down Sauron at the end of the Second Age, though it would cost them their own lives. We come to it at last, the mighty dwarves of Middle-earth and their great axes. This race is so synonymous with the axe that it is referenced in their famous battle cry, Baruch Kazad, Kazad Imenu, which translates to, "Axes of the dwarves are upon you." In the First Age, we know the dwarves of Belegost bore axes, including their lord, Azagal. Azagal and his people fought in the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, and faced off with the great dragon Glaurung. There, they surround Glaurung, and we are told that even the dragon's scales are not strong enough to shield him from the blows of the dwarven axes. Enraged at this, Glaurung strikes down the Lord of Belegost, who, with his dying breath, drives a knife into Glaurung's belly, causing the dragon to flee. As the dwarves carry Azagal from the field of battle, much like a funeral procession, they pay no attention to their foes, but no foe would dare attack the fearsome dwarves. Also in the early days of Middle-earth, Durin I is believed to have owned a great axe that was an heirloom of his line. The axe is lost in 1981 of the Third Age, when the dwarves wake the Balrog, leading them to abandon Khazad-dûm. Over 1,000 years later, in 2989, Balin leads a successful expedition to recolonize Moria, where they find Durin's axe, among many other treasures of their people. However, the axe would be lost again in 2994, when the colony is destroyed and Balin is slain. Every great conflict involving dwarves naturally included the use of axes, such as the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, and the Battle of Five Armies, both of which feature the red axe of Dain Ironfoot. In the Battle of Azanabalzar, Dain uses the axe to hew the head off Azog. Later, in the Third Age, during the War of the Ring, Easterlings are sent to the area of the Lonely Mountain by Sauron. Dain, now king of Erebor and 250 years old, fights in the Battle of Dale, wielding his red axe once again, defending the body of King Brand before he also falls to the enemy. Speaking of the Easterlings, they were also known to wield axes in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, where they are among the most effective of the Witch King's forces. Finally, we can't talk axes without bringing up Gimli, son of Glóin, the dwarf hero of the Fellowship of the Ring. In the book, we are told Gimli carries a broad-bladed axe. With his axe, Gimli fights valiantly against the enemies of the Free Peoples. From the chamber of Mazarbul, to the ambush at Amon Hen, to besting his archer friend in their contest at Helm's Deep and beyond. Now that we've completed this series on famous weapons in Middle-earth, what other topics would you like to see covered here on the channel? Be sure to let me know below in the comments. As always, a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Gail Elizabeth, Jim Limber-Davis, Jay Brakefield, Timothy Park, Sky Carcass, Zetrock, Grand Strategy Nerd, The Dark-Haired One, Salim Rahman, Wyland, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.